So this is the third, we're doing a 4-week series at the moment. This is the third session in the series. Don't worry if you haven't been to the others, it will still make sense by itself. But we're doing a series on something called the sevenfold puja. So puja means ritual. So this is basically one of the main rituals we do in our tradition. So how many of you have actually done a sevenfold puja before? Okay, so probably about half, yeah. So the reason we decided to, so Monday nights isn't normally a ritual night. We don't normally do ritual on this night, but the reason we decided to do it was because you can actually come along to the Buddhist Centre for quite a long time and never actually experience any ritual. So we just thought we'd do a 4-week series where we'd talk about ritual in a bit more detail. And I think it's interesting. In our tradition, it's easy, when you first come along, there's a lot of emphasis on meditation, kind of like study and kind of friendship. But you can, like I said, you can go for a while without necessarily experiencing ritual. But in different Buddhist traditions, that's not the case. So I was in India recently, and there were lots of Tibetans there. And my friend got in a conversation with a Tibetan monk. So he'd kind of been training in Tibetan monk, and he said, "Oh, do you do much meditation?" And he'd been a monk for 7 years, and he's like, "No, not really. I've only done ritual so far." So he'd been training as a monk for 7 years, and he was primarily just doing ritual for all of that time. He said, "Oh, I've just started doing a little bit of meditation." So it's quite interesting, isn't it? It's easy for us to feel like ritual is just like an added extra. It's like, oh yeah, if I'm feeling like I want something, yeah, I'll do a ritual, but mainly it's just about meditation. But that's not the case in all traditions. So I just wanted to bring that in. So I thought it was really interesting. So these verses, we do the sevenfold puja, and they're verses from a text called the Bodhicharyavatara. And they're words from an 8th century Indian monk called Shantideva. And so these are words, we use these words because they're words that have come from a highly realized mind, a very spiritually developed mind. So these are kind of words that he composed in an act of kind of devotion and reverence. And then by saying them, what we're doing is we recite them, and through doing that, we start to inhabit that mind. Yeah, so he wrote these words, and then by reciting them back, we can begin to inhabit more of the mind that he had when he composed them. And in that way, reciting it moves us in the direction of enlightenment. So that's kind of why we use those ones, is so we can begin to inhabit a mind that's closer to enlightenment. And so there's 7 sections in the sevenfold puja. So it's called sevenfold, so there's 7 sections. And we'll be looking at 2 of the verses. One of them's called Confession of Faults, and one of them's called Rejoicing in Merits. So we're looking at Confession of Faults and Rejoicing in Merits. Now the other sections will be looked at in different weeks, but this week we're focusing on these 2. Now these verses are particularly looking at karma. Basically, they're looking at karma in these 2. And so karma is kind of the foundation of these verses. So these verses only make sense on the basis of karma. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the Buddhist perspective on karma, because I think lots of people, I think pretty much everyone's heard of karma in some form. But Buddhism has a very specific emphasis it has a specific way that it uses karma. So I think everyone's familiar with kind of like actions have consequences, but Buddhism has a very specific emphasis. So karma basically means action. Yeah, so that karma just means action. And what Buddhism says is that all action, which would say karma, all action has an appropriate effect depending on the mental state that gave rise to that action. Yeah, so all actions have a consequence that's appropriate to the mental state that made us act in that way. So these are actions. This is another emphasis of Buddhism. So it's body, speech, and mind. Yeah, so it's not just what we do with our body. It's not just what we do with our speech. It's also what we do with our mind. All of these things have an effect depending on the mental state that gave rise to those actions. So what we do with our body, what we say with our speech, and what happens in our mind all matter. Buddhism doesn't let us off at any point. Well, it's not Buddhism. What Buddhism is saying is this is what the universe is like, but it's saying that there's no secret that we can get away from. Every act that we do has an effect. And the laws of the universe are such that certain actions lead to positive mental states, lead to happiness, lead to freedom, and other actions lead to suffering. So there's certain things that we do that will lead to a positive state of mind, that will lead us to feeling freer, happier, more connected with others. And there are other things that we do that will lead us to feeling unhappy, disconnected from other people, and essentially suffer. And that's not the Buddha's not decided this. He's just discovered that that's how the mind works. And so we can choose what direction we move in with our actions. And it's not just that they have, so it's not just that they have an external effect, basically. This is one of the distinctive emphasis of Buddhism, is that our actions don't just have an effect externally, they have an effect on our mind. So for example, if we were really angry with someone and we shouted at them, it's not just saying that we'd make them unhappy, therefore it's bad. That would happen. If we shout at someone because we're angry, we'll probably upset them, but also it will make us suffer. It will lead to a negative mental state in our mind. And vice versa, if we say something kind to someone, if we say something positive to someone, that will probably make them feel better, but also it will give rise to more positive mental states in our mind. Yeah, so it's not just that it has an effect externally, it has an effect internally. So practicing ethics is about learning to act more and more in a way that will lead to positivity, growth and freedom. So we're trying to learn. So it is something that we can do. It's something that we can learn. So we're trying to act more and more in a way that will lead to positive states of mind and will lead to growth, and less in a way that will lead to suffering. And it's saying that we can practice at this and we can get better. Yeah, so it's not that we're either good or bad. It's that we can just learn to act more and more in what we'd call skillful ways. So there's skillful action and unskillful action. There's action skillful action is the action that leads us in the direction of enlightenment, and then unskillful action leads us away from enlightenment towards suffering. Now, a traditional image for this that I really like. This is one of the first teachings I heard of Buddhism, and it was one of the ones that really got me. It's that when we actions of body, speech and mind, every time we do any sort of action, it's like planting a seed. And there are wholesome seeds and there are unwholesome seeds. So every time we act skillfully, it's like we're planting a wholesome seed in the mind. And every time we act unskillfully, it's like we're planting every time we act unskillfully, it's like we're planting an unwholesome seed in the mind. So every action we do is planting a seed, basically. And then wholesome seeds, when they come to fruition, that leads to positive states of mind. And unwholesome seeds, when they come to fruition, leads to suffering. Yeah, so every action we do is planting these seeds, and depending on how many seeds we've planted of wholesome seeds, that leads to positive states of mind. And that's what we're trying to move in the direction of. So tonight's verses are basically, there's two sections. So confession of faults, that's basically about taking ownership for all the unwholesome seeds we've planted. It's about acknowledging what our actions that have led to us planting unwholesome seeds. And then there's another verse that's about rejoicing in the wholesome seeds that are planted everywhere. Yeah, so it's about rejoicing in the good done by all beings. And that was part of the meditation that we're doing there, was to kind of get us in that mode of rejoicing in the good done. So I think I'll leave that there for now. When we come back, we'll hear the verses and then we'll explore them and unpack them. But yeah, I think the main thing I want to emphasize just from this bit is just that all the actions that we do are planting seeds all the time that are going to come to fruition in either leading to happiness or suffering. And these verses that we're going to explore are kind of bringing these out in kind of like dramatic, beautiful, poetic language. Yeah, so we'll go have a tea break now, and then we'll come back and explore these verses in more detail. So what we'll do now, we're just going to... So I said we're going to be looking at these two verses. We're going to be looking at the confession of faults, and we're going to be looking at rejoicing in merits. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit for a minute or so, and then in call and response, we're going to recite the first verse. So we're going to recite the confession of faults, and then we'll have a bit of time to explore that together. So if you want to set up into meditation, and then we'll just sit quietly for a minute or so, and then I'll ring a bell, and then I'll say a line and then you say it back, and then we'll have some time to explore it. the evil that I have heaped up through my ignorance and foolishness. Evil in the world of everyday experience. As well as evil in understanding and intelligence. All that I acknowledge to the protectors. Standing before them. With hands raised in reverence. And terrified of suffering. I pay salutations again and again. May the leaders receive this kindly. Just as it is with its many faults. What is not good, O protectors? I shall not do again. Okay, so if you want to open your eyes, and then turn to the person next to you and just talk about did you have any responses or reactions or thoughts on the verse we just did? Did anything stand out in any way? Yeah, so have a talk to the person next to you. Okay, so can anyone share with us there any responses, reactions to the verse that we've just done?
I think the line "terrified of suffering" was really interesting. Because in general, Buddhism teaches us to confront suffering and to face it and to find ways to alleviate it in our lives and to deal with it. So that being terrified of suffering, I found that quite interesting.
Yeah, it's strong, that line, isn't it? Yeah. It's terrified. It's not. Yeah. I've got stuff to say about that later, so I'm not going to respond to it now. We'll come back to it. Yeah.
We also found evil as a word, sort of guilt-provoking and strong too.
Yeah.
Just found it quite hard to encompass that with some of the other Buddhist teachings.
Yeah. Again, strong language, isn't it? Yeah, it's like my evil. Oh. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I was saying that's my least favourite part because it does remind me of Catholicism. Not very nice memories of Catholicism, thinking about evil and sin.
Yeah. I think that's common. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess to kind of counter that, there was just this one part of the verses that was talking about receiving all of that with kindness. And I think that was something that stuck to me a little bit more because it felt like it relieved a little bit of that evilness in us, and it's kind of recognizing that it's part of everyone's life in a way, and you have to confront it in a way. You have to do it with kindness. I don't know if that was the point of it, but
yeah. So may the leaders receive this kindly. So it's kind of being received with kindness, not judgment and anger. And yeah. Thank you. These are all kind of the responses that I was kind of wanting. So it's not. They're not wrong. They're kind of what I was expecting. So yeah, it's good. We can go into it. But I think the language of this. I was kind of glad I was given this verse to do, and I was kind of like, oh no. But it's the verse that has the strongest language. So I think there's lots to unpack in there. So thank you for saying all those things. I think that's a good point to start at. So confession. Let's just start with the word confession. So it's a confession of faults, but confession can be a tricky word for some people. Kind of what you're alluding to. It can have, for people that were raised in different religious traditions, it can have certain connotations to it. Especially, I've heard of people who are from Catholic upbringings. It can have quite negative connotations to it because it's quite a specific thing. And we need to kind of learn to remove the connotations with that towards a more dharmic more Buddhist perspective on it. So in Buddhism, confession is simply an acknowledgement of when we haven't lived up to our ideals. So in Buddhism, if we're practicing Buddhism, we've taken up the ideal that we want to move towards the mind of a Buddha. We want to practice his teachings so that we can move toward a mind that's freer, wiser, more compassionate. And confession is simply acknowledging when we haven't lived up to those ideals. So in the way that we've acted with our body, speech and mind hasn't lived up to those ideals. And usually in this situation, we might confess to other friends who are also trying to live up to those ideals. So I think that's an important thing. We can't actually confess we can't confess to someone unless they're also trying to do the same thing, because there isn't that shared basis. So it's kind of, if you're with someone, you're both trying to move in the same direction, it's then that you can say, oh, actually, I haven't lived up to that. And because you're both trying to do the same thing, it'll be received in the right way and understood in the right way. And yeah, it's not that we're confessing to some spiritual authority whose job it is to kind of purify us and send us on our way. It's not like that in Buddhism. It's kind of the act of confessing itself is what we're trying to do. There isn't so much of a ritual aspect to it. But to acknowledge that we want to act in a positive way, and that we want to act in a skillful way, and we haven't acted in that way, in itself is a skillful act. So confessing in itself is a skillful act. So say we've acted in a way where we've planted some unwholesome seeds in the language that we were talking about earlier. Once we've done that, there's nothing we can do about that. We've planted that seed. But what we can do is confess it, and that will be planting positive seeds in response to it. So it's something positive we can do in response to when we have acted in a way that we don't want to. And it's also helpful because it means we bring more awareness to our ethical life. So Buddhism teaches there's a threefold path. There's ethics, meditation, and wisdom. And why confession's important is because it means that we're bringing awareness to our ethical life. It's quite hard actually to be aware of our ethical life if we're not in communication about it. It's really hard because our tendency is towards unawareness, basically. We have such a strong tendency towards not really noticing what we're doing, what our mind's doing. If we're not in communication about our actions, it's really hard to actually have awareness about our ethical life. So that's why talking about it, confessing when we've done things that we hadn't done, brings more awareness to it and makes it more likely that we're going to be able to change our habits and not do that again in the future. Yeah, so it kind of, by talking about our ethics, it makes it more on our radar in a certain way. It makes ethics more on our radar. And here what we're confessing is our faults. So it's called confession of faults. And I think there's an important thing to be aware of here as well. So the language of faults, it implies a shortcoming or a transgression. But it's important to note that when we're talking about faults here, we're talking about actions. We're talking about things that we've done. We're not talking about flaws or defects in our character. Yeah, so it's not that we have the faults or we are sinful or we are wrong or broken. It's that we've acted in a way that we'd rather we didn't. And we're confessing our fault, we're confessing our action, not some flaw or defect with ourselves. So we're simply just confessing that action that I did I'd rather not have acted in that way. And yeah, the Bodhicharyavatara uses poetic language. So we've mentioned a few of the things. So we've got terrified, we've got evil. It uses poetic language. And the reason it does this is because poetic language adds strength to the work, basically. It adds strength to the work. You can think about this as a piece of literature, and it uses poetic language to add strength, and it makes us more likely to be moved by the language. So even the fact that we might have a response of like, oh, I don't know how I feel about that, oh, I don't like that word, that's because the language has strength and we're more likely to be moved by it. Whereas if it had used much more tepid language, we might not be so moved by it. And so I think it is important that it uses that language. We just need to get used to the way that it's using it and make sure that we're not misunderstanding it or putting understanding from different traditions onto it. So some people can be put off by the language, especially at first it can feel like, oh, I don't like that language. But what we can do is we can treat it as if it's a drama. Yeah, we can treat this as if we're enacting a drama. So imagine in Shakespeare, it's like it uses the most large language it can, because then it fully moves people, and it's kind of a bit like that, what we're doing here. We're trying to use these this poetic language to move us. So Shantideva uses the word evil. And I think, like you mentioned, this is probably the bit that most people don't like this word. We don't like using the word evil. We don't like the idea of being evil, and we don't like the idea of having done evil. It's a really strong word, and it has other connotations as well. And yeah, to think of something or someone as evil, it doesn't even feel very Buddhist, really, does it? It's kind of, that's not how we talk about stuff. We don't say in the Metta Bhavana, now bring to mind someone evil in the fourth stage. It's not normally the language we use, but it's using this here for a reason. And even Mara, so in the Buddhist tradition, there's this character called Mara, which is basically a personification of all the forces that try and hold us back. Even Mara in Buddhism, he isn't seen as some like satanic figure. He's more of this trickster, sort of pesky sort of figure. So even the personification of these forces in Buddhism isn't seen as evil in the way that like maybe Satan or the devil would. I watched Nosferatu a couple of days ago. Has anyone seen Nosferatu? Yeah, he's this vampire in this new film, and he's definitely evil. If you watch, he's definitely evil. But that's not what that's not a Buddhist perspective. But what we're using here, when we say evil, basically what we're talking about is actions. So actions of body, speech, and mind that are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. Yes, so it's all the actions that we do that are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And these are actions that all of us do. All unenlightened beings are going to act from a place of greed, hatred, and delusion a lot of the time. And so that's what we're referring to here when we talk about evil. We're not talking about kind of large acts of like murder or those sorts of things necessarily. Well, most of the time we're probably not talking about those. We're just talking about the actions that are rooted in greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's basically a dramatic way of saying all the unskillful actions that I've done. But it probably wouldn't have the same poetic effect if it started the verse with all the unskillful things that I've done, rather than the evil that I've heaped up. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of, it has a lot more emotive power, doesn't it? The evil that I've heaped up. But really what that's saying is all the things that I've done from a basis of greed, hatred, and delusion. So that's what we're basically saying. So that's the evil that I've heaped up. Next we've got through my ignorance and foolishness. So that's another another one we've got to take on the chin. So through my ignorance and foolishness. And Shantideva is like really making our ego take a battering here. If you read the full Bodhicharyavatara, he pulls absolutely no punches whatsoever. There's some lines that are much more confronting than this. So it's through my ignorance and foolishness. And it's basically making us acknowledge that at times we can be ignorant and we can be foolish. So we can all be ignorant, we can all be foolish. We're trying to act in a way that we think will make us happy. That's basically what we're always acting in a way that we're trying to make ourselves happy. But because we're ignorant and because we're foolish, a lot of the time it doesn't work. We make ourselves suffer and we make other people suffer. So it's not that we're trying to do something wrong. It's not that we're evil or bad. It's just that we're ignorant and foolish to what actually works. So a lot of the time when we're acting, it doesn't actually work. And we start off by just acknowledging this fully. We just acknowledge fully that, okay, I can be ignorant and I can be foolish. And if we want to maintain the view of ourselves that we're always wise and we never act foolishly, if we really want to maintain that view, it will be really hard to work on our ethics. So if we have this view that, no, I am wise and I always act well, it's going to be really hard to acknowledge, actually, a lot of the time I'm not. So it's important that we can just face up to the fact that, like, I can be ignorant and I can be foolish. So that's the through my ignorance and foolishness. Evil, the next line is evil in the world of everyday experience. Now I think this balances out the first one a bit. So in the world of everyday experience, So like I said, it's not necessarily confessing these dramatic acts of evil like Nosferatu or things like that. It's just these things that we do, these problems that we get ourselves into, these difficulties that we get ourselves into in our everyday lives. So it could be like snapping at our friends or colleagues. It could be lying. If we want to save face to people, we can tell a lie. Or it can be manipulating other people kind of subtly to get our own way. All of these things that we kind of all do in subtle ways in everyday experience. That's what it's talking about here. And then next it says, as well as evil in understanding and intelligence. So it's not just our actions, it's also our views. So Buddhism has a strong emphasis on right view. So it's called right view, and this is basically the basis of developing wisdom is right view, which is seeing things how they really are. So it's kind of taking on a view where we can see clearly what's going on, and it's going to be a helpful way of seeing things for us to grow. But wrong view is when we're not seeing clearly. So when we say, as well as evil in understanding and intelligence, that's kind of acknowledging that a lot of the time we aren't seeing things clearly. We don't have full right view. We've got wrong view. Okay, I'll just pause there in case there's any questions and all of that. I covered quite a lot there. Have we got any questions from those bits? We all okay with evil now? All on board with evil? Yeah. Okay. So next we've got all this I acknowledge to the protectors. So we've confessed all of our faults. We've kind of said that we've got all of these things, and now we're acknowledging this to the protectors. Now, when this verse talks about the protectors, it's talking about the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Yeah, so these are kind of enlightened beings. Now, normally when we confess, if we're confessing in a Buddhist tradition, we confess to another person. So we'd be confessing to another person trying to practice ethics. But in the puja, what we're saying is we're confessing to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Now, a Buddha, if you confess to a Buddha, you can be fully sure that a Buddha would fully accept any confession that you made with compassion. Yeah, so if you told a Buddha anything, they would fully accept it with compassion. And because the Buddha knew that anyone could change, the Buddha knew that any human being, no matter what they'd done, had the possibility to change. Now, there was a murderer called Angulimala in the Buddhist scriptures. Now, Angulimala means kind of fingered necklace. So he'd gone around and he'd killed all these people and cut off their fingers and made a necklace out of them. So this was a bad guy. But the Buddha managed to turn him around. With the Buddha's wisdom and compassion, he managed to turn this murderer around, and eventually he gained enlightenment. So the Buddha would teach anyone. If anyone was receptive and willing to learn, the Buddha would teach anyone. So there's no one who the Buddha wouldn't accept and accept their confession. If it was a full confession, he wouldn't accept it with compassion. So if we fully took up the view that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas could hear and accept our confessions, when we're doing the puja, we're kind of taking on this drama, we're taking up this drama. If we could really fully take up that we are confessing to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, it would have just as much effect as if we're doing it to another person, maybe even more effect, because we'd know that a Buddha would never kind of judge us. It might even have more of an effect. So when we're doing this verse, we can kind of try and get into what it would feel like to confess to a Buddha or a Bodhisattva. Next up, we've got this line, terrified of suffering, which you mentioned. So we've got terrified of suffering. So again, this is using highly dramatic and poetic language. And like I think you said this, so Buddhism doesn't normally encourage us to act out of fear. So fear is kind of a negative mental state, and Buddhism wouldn't normally encourage us to act out of fear. But what I think this is trying to get at is a lot of the time we don't truly understand that we suffer. A lot of the time we don't actually realise that we're making ourselves suffer with our actions. So if we truly understood how much we suffer, and if we truly knew how unpleasant unenlightenment was compared to enlightenment, maybe we would be terrified of it. Maybe we would be terrified of the suffering that we experience. So it's kind of in contrast to a mind that's completely free of any suffering. Our mind would be terrifying. Yeah, and then we end with what is not good. What is not good, O protectors, I shall not do again. So it's at the end. So we've gone through this arc. So we've confessed it. We've confessed all the things, all of our actions, and then we've confessed it up to the Buddhas. And at the end we say, what is not good, I shall not do again. So we end with a resolution to not make the same mistakes again, basically. So we say before the Buddhas that we won't do it again. And what will happen is we'll inevitably then fall short. We'll inevitably fall back into the same old habits. But then again, we'll confess them again, and then we'll try and make a resolution. It's basically, it can feel a bit like going round in a circle, especially if they're deep-rooted habits. It can feel a lot like going round in a circle, like, oh, I'm trying to change, I make the same mistakes, I'm trying to change again and making the same mistakes. But actually what's happening is we're not just going round and around in a circle. Every time we confess it and every time we try and move forward, it's like we're moving up a little bit. And we're becoming a bit more refined, and we're transcending our state a bit more. So it's not like we're going round in a wheel. It's more like we're going round and round in a spiral. So even though we might find that we have to confess the same things again, we're going through the same patterns. We're kind of going up and getting more and more refined, and our ethical life is becoming more and more refined, and we're moving in the direction of enlightenment. Yeah. So that's kind of the pattern. Is we try and act skillfully, we'll inevitably fall short, we confess it, but then we try and then we make a confession, try and make amends, and then we just keep on going. And gradually through time we'll find that we're becoming much more ethical, and our mind is becoming more refined. Yeah, so that's the confession of faults section. Okay, anyone got any questions from that whole bit before we move on to the next one? Okay, great. So let's set up into meditation again. We'll just sit for a minute or so, and then we'll do the next verse. I rejoice with delight.
I rejoice with delight.
In the good done by all beings.
In the good done by all beings.
Through which they obtain rest.
Through which they obtain rest.
With the end of suffering.
With the end of suffering.
May those who have suffered be happy.
May those who have suffered be happy.
I rejoice in the release of beings.
I rejoice in the release of beings.
From the sufferings of the rounds of existence.
From the sufferings of the rounds of existence.
I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattva.
I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattva.
And the Buddha.
And the Buddha.
Who are protectors.
Who are protectors.
I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment.
I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment.
And the teaching.
And the teaching.
Those oceans that bring happiness to all beings.
Those oceans that bring happiness to all beings.
And are the abode of welfare of all beings.
And are the abode of welfare of all beings.
Okay, any responses to this verse?
Should I start again?
Yeah, you can go.
I just love the inclusivity of the language. Typically when we think about good deeds or good actions, it's always focused on us and what we've done and what we've achieved, and oh, look at me, I'm so great, look at me. But it's such a nice feeling to enjoy someone's, or to wish someone as much goodwill as you wish yourself, and to enjoy what they're enjoying as much as they are, and reveling in their success, and just that wishing for everyone to be happy. And the world needs more of that, and I just love that inclusivity of it.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I just it's probably going back to the exercise at the start, where we were thinking about other people doing good deeds in a way, it's just the movement of considering what other people have done that's good doesn't feel very natural to me. Just thinking in those kind of broad terms of considering the good that other people do. It's not actually a common thought or take.
Yeah, it's often not where the mind naturally goes, is it? We naturally go more towards finding faults with things than noticing all the good things. Yeah. Okay, all right. We'll work our way through it. So yeah, we'll start. It's called rejoicing in merit, and then merit here. This is a specific Buddhist term here. So it's a translation for the word punya, and the translation's merit. And this is basically merit is in Buddhism. It's a beneficial and protective force that's built up by positive acts of body, speech, and mind. So it's as if by doing these positive acts, it creates a protective force in the mind. And then meritorious acts are acts that lead to positive mental states and growth towards enlightenment. What we talked about earlier with the planting the seeds. It's kind of like these are the actions, meritorious actions, are the ones that are planting the positive seeds. And again, so it's talked about rejoicing. So it's saying rejoicing in the merit. So rejoicing is a very positive act. When we see something good, rejoicing accentuates and strengthens our positive response. Yeah, so we can train our mind to respond positively towards things by rejoicing in them. We can kind of strengthen and accentuate our positive response by rejoicing in things. And as well as that, it puts more positivity out into the world. So by rejoicing when we see positive things, it brings more positivity into the world. And in our tradition, there's a big emphasis on rejoicing in each other. If you see positive qualities in other people, we're encouraged to rejoice in them and to say them, and also rejoicing about people when they're not there, and then reporting back. It's like a network of positivity going on. So it's quite common to hear, oh, so-and-so was rejoicing in you the other day and stuff like that. So it's kind of this, it's strongly emphasised in our tradition because it has this effect of uplifting our minds, but also just uplifting the environment that we're in. It can create a much more kind of positive and atmosphere that supports growth if there's a lot of rejoicing going on. Because like you were saying, it goes against our tendency to find fault. It's just unenlightened beings. We tend to find fault in things. We've got a much more negativity bias towards seeing things that are wrong rather than things that are good. So by rejoicing, we're kind of going against that, and we're training the mind to spot positives more. But also with other people, they're much less likely to be able to see their positive qualities than we are. And it's the same with us. We're less likely to see our truly positive qualities than other people are. So by rejoicing in each other, you can bring out the positive qualities both in other people and then have the positive qualities brought out in you. So it's really good if you can to get into the habit of rejoicing wherever possible. Even outside of a Buddhist context, it's really good to do, even if people are a bit taken aback. I've had it before where kind of I rejoice in my family, and it's a bit oh, okay, thank you. But you can see that it has a positive effect, even if it's not necessarily expected. So it's really good to try and just get into the habit of doing it everywhere. But yeah, in our tradition, it's especially kind of emphasised. So the first line is, I rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings, through which they obtain rest with the end of suffering. I think it's such a good line. So it's, I rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings, through which they obtain rest with the end of suffering. So it's kind of the emphasis here is through which they obtain rest. That's such a nice image, isn't it? It's like we do good and through that we obtain rest. It's like it highlights how important skillful action is for peace of mind. If we want to have peace of mind, that comes through acting skillfully. So it's through doing good that we can obtain rest. So if we've spent the day doing something that we know is unskillful, or we feel ethically uncompromised, if we feel ethically compromised about it, it's hard to relax and it's hard to feel at ease. Whereas if you've ever had a day where you've just been really sure that you've done something really positive, you end the day feeling much more at ease. I know if I've ever had kind of communications with people where I know it's been a really positive communication, either we've kind of really explored something, or I know I've been able to feel helpful to them in it. Afterwards, there's just this real sense of just ease in the mind, where it can just kind of relax into knowing, oh, I'm doing good, I don't know quite how to explain it, but there is this kind of like ease to it. So I really like this image of through which they obtain rest. So it's through skillful action that we can obtain rest. The next thing to draw out is that it says all beings. So it's all beings. So I rejoice in the good done by all beings. So it's including everyone everywhere. So it's not just rejoicing in the good done by Buddhists. It's not saying I rejoice in the good done by Buddhists or this people and that people. It's all beings everywhere. Because karma is a universal law. So it's a universal law that applies to all beings, whether they know it or not, whether they believe in it or not. Karma is at work all the time. So whenever any being acts skillfully, whether they would think about, oh, I'm acting skillfully or not, if they act skillfully, they are moving in the direction of enlightenment. They are moving their mind in a direction of more freedom, more happiness, and freedom from suffering. So it's rejoicing in all beings everywhere for the good that they've done. And so they obtain rest with the end of suffering. So it's unskillful actions that cause us to suffer. And it's only if we act skillfully that we'll find the end of suffering. So it's only through skillful action that suffering will come to an end. Okay, and the next line is, I rejoice, just moving down a little bit, I rejoice in the nature of the Bodhisattvas and the Buddha who are protectors. So we started off by rejoicing in the good done by all beings. So we've rejoiced in the actions, the positive actions done by all beings. But unenlightened beings like us, we need to make effort if we want to act ethically, we need to make effort. So it's kind of, this is rejoicing in the effort that's been made to act in a skillful way so that their minds are more positive and the world's more positive. But it's in our nature, as unenlightened beings, it's in our nature to act unskillfully. And that is just the state of the unenlightened mind, is we're going to naturally act unskillfully, and we need to make effort to go against that. However, here we're rejoicing in the nature of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. So we're not just rejoicing in their actions, we're rejoicing in their nature. So it's in the nature of it's in the nature of enlightened beings to act skillfully. So it's in their very nature to act skillfully. So there's no way for a Buddha to act unskillfully, because there's no instinct for a Buddha to prioritize themselves. There's no instinct to put themselves in the center of the world and try and manipulate everything else for their own end. So a Buddha's completely freed themselves from that. So there's no way for them to act unskillfully. So here we're not just rejoicing in the acts of a Buddha, we're rejoicing in the nature of the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. And this is what we're moving towards. We can move towards a state where our nature is more and more skillful. So it's more and more our natural inclination to act skillfully, to act positively. And that's what we're trying to move towards. Okay, and I'll just do this last line here now. So it says, I rejoice with delight in the good done by all beings, through which they obtain rest with the end of suffering. I rejoice in the arising of the will to enlightenment and the teaching, those oceans that bring happiness to all beings and are the abode of welfare of all beings. So that's what we finish with. Those oceans that bring happiness to all beings and are the abode of welfare of all beings. So here it refers to the Dharma as an ocean. Yes, this is the image of the ocean. This is quite a traditional image for the Dharma. So the ocean, it's vast and it's deep. Yeah, so an ocean is vast and it's deep. So the Dharma is vast and deep. And in an ocean, you start at the shore. We start at the shore. And as we go in, we find it gets deeper and deeper. And the further we go in, the deeper and deeper it gets. And this is what the Dharma is like. This is what the Buddha's teaching is like. So we start off in the water, but the further we go in, the deeper it becomes and the vaster it becomes. And there's no it's kind of infinitely spanning out. So there's no limit to the truths of the Dharma. There's no limit to how it can be expressed in the world and how it can help beings. And the realizations just keep on deepening and keep on becoming more broad. So that's where it finishes. It says, so the ocean that bring happiness to all beings and are the abode of welfare of all beings. Yeah, so we've looked at confession of faults and rejoicing in merits. And you can kind of see how these two kind of talk. I said at the beginning about how planting the seeds, so there's planting unwholesome seeds and there's planting wholesome seeds. And you can kind of see how these two verses have kind of very different feelings to them, don't they? Kind of, they've got a very different feeling tone when you do them. One kind of does put you in touch with the difficulty of being human, the difficulty of the way that we act, and then the other one kind of lifts us up and puts us in touch with kind of the positivity and the joy of positive action. So